Testing, testing, testing. Can anybody hear me? Testing, testing. Okay, testing. Sounds like we're good. All right. We're there. We made it. I just basically went on YouTube to double check. All right. Welcome to CanHammer, your source for Warhammer from the Great White North. Today, we are going over Death Guard, continuing our series of a deep dive into the 9th edition Death Guard book, and how we can approach this book in the competitive meta. We're bringing a competitive mindset. So, this is going to be useful, I think, for everybody, but particularly for those people that want to play this army competitively. At the moment, Death Guard are the only real Chaos book that has been adjusted for the 9th edition rules set. It's not to say that... okay, thank you, Frozen Warrior. It's not to say that other books can't be made to be competitive. I mean, Demons, some elements of, say, Emperor's Children have done well, but at the moment, Death Guard seems to be the strongest entry into Chaos right now. And so if you're a diehard Chaos player and want to play something Chaos competitively, Death Guard is probably where you want to lean. And if you've always been a Death Guard player, sounds good. Keep in mind that these discussions always revolve around a mono Death Guard competitive lens. We don't really talk about souping. We can talk about souping in a later episode. The reason why we're approaching this from a mono Death Guard perspective is because these books don't seem to want to encourage, not necessarily that they're discouraging too much. It's not that they're saying you cannot soup armies, but you're not getting a lot of benefit from souping. This cross synergies between older books, you can see the facts are removing those. And I think as the new books drop, you'll see that they might be nice to have, but you're really going to be sacrificing some of the special rules these books offer to do that. Okay, enough blabbering on. Let's talk about it. So today we're going over fast attack and heavy support options. I'm going to apologize in advance. Kind of mailed it in today on the layouts, on the pictures, on the whatever else visual aids, and just realizing I forgot to update the banner. So let me know if that in the comments below, if the visual aids are something that you appreciate with these streams, then I will continue doing them. If they're give or take, if you guys don't really care, then I won't bother spending the time putting them together. But if it does bring value, we definitely can continue it. All right, so we've already reviewed elites, troops, and all that, HQs, spells, all that. So now we're kind of nearing the end of the options in the Death Guard book. And after that, we're going to talk about where Death Guard is and how we're going to approach our list building. And particularly now, since the meta is shifting with regards to new releases such as Sisters, AdMech, and Drukhari is somewhat a new release, but they're kind of old news, albeit still a very, very strong army, potentially number 1 or 2. Keep in mind, again, the units I do not speak of doesn't mean they're necessarily bad and never have a place. They're just, I feel these units will take a lot of effort, can end up being darling units, which is dangerous in a competitive list design. And so they can possibly work. Somebody might say, "Oh, my list used whatever unit that you didn't mention, and I did well with it." Of course you did, but it just might not be the most efficient way of approaching it, in my opinion. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Chaos Spawn. Why do I want to talk about the Chaos Spawn? Well, it's a 4-wound model that uniquely moves 7 inches. It is a beast, so one of the benefits there is that it can take advantage of breachable terrain in the sense that it won't be hampered by walls generally. And then it's 7-inch move, whereas your Terminators, Plague Marines, and Poxwalkers are 4 to 5-inch move. This is 7. It's just a little extra that can get you on objective sooner. It's 4 wounds, and at the moment they're 23 points a model, and you can take them in units of 1. So why do I find that interesting? Well, there's several things. You can take them in units of 5 models. You can take them in units of 1 model. 1 to 3 models, you can spend Grandfatherly Influence for 1 CP to give him Disgustingly Resilient and to make him T6. Not half bad. At 5 models, you can spend 2 CP to do the same. There's a less return on investment there, potentially. I haven't tried the big unit of 5 model, big 5-man unit of Spawn. There might be some value to that if you put the 2 CP into them. I mean, I could potentially try that at some point. They are still a very, very cheap unit. You're talking, 5 models at 23 points. What is that? 115 points. Very cheap. What would end up being 20 wounds at toughness 6. So, strength 3 weapons are wounding on 6s. Strength 4 weapons are wounding on 5s. Some of the downsides, and then if you were to upgrade them with Grandfatherly Influence, of course, them being toughness 6, you did. They'd be -1 damage. So in the event an enemy's shooting 2 damage weapons at them, or 3 damage weapons, they'd be -1. They have a couple other nice to have rules in terms of their combat. They're not half bad in combat. They are only weapon skill 4, but they're 2d3 attacks. Their weapon is 2 damage -2, so they can actually go into 2 wound models reasonably well, like your standard Marine body. They have their mutated limbs that you can roll, and either you can get an AP characteristic 4, 3d3 attacks, or reroll wounds with them. They also give a 6-inch -1 leadership aura, which is, it's nice to have, but you're not going out of your way to really make use of that too much. So why am I mentioning where these come from? Well, I mention them more so because they might be interesting. These are the types of models you might take when you approach list design, in the sense that you're looking at how you're going to score. So what are some of the ways you want to score? Well, some of the best ways of scoring in the game is scoring independent of what your opponent is doing. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is you don't have to interact with the opponent to score. And one way of doing that is objectives that don't require you killing the enemy. Something like that includes like engage in all fronts. Now, typically some people might criticize engage in all fronts for Death Guard for several reasons. Death Guard's slow, so it's harder for us to get into different table quarters. Some missions facilitate that. When your deployment zone is a quarter deployment zone, you're already kind of finding yourself in three quarters, so then you can already kind of take advantage of that. But you might run into issues if you have a hammer and anvil style deployment, or even Dawn of War style deployment, where you're still deploying at least 12 inches away from the other side, where you could start scoring cage. Another issue where that might come into play, where you might criticize, is that Death Guard have typically very expensive units, on top of them being very slow. So not only are you going to have a hard time getting there, but you may potentially also be committing expensive units for that sole purpose, which is why you may not see some Death Guard players take it. I'm not saying it's always the go-to. Engage in all fronts sometimes may put you in a disadvantageous position, but given that it is a secondary where you can minimize your interaction with the opponent, we can start to look at how we can design the list to do that without compromising too much of our ability to interact with the opponent. And that's where Chaos Spawn might come in. You can take them as 1-man units, 2-man units, or 2 beast units, or whatever. And at a relatively low cost of 23 points, 46 points, whatever you take them in, you have a unit there that isn't very expensive, reasonably durable to small arms. I mean, if an enemy wants to kill them, they will kill them. But because of their small profile, be it one model, I think, that are on 40 or 50 mil bases, or 2, they're easier to hide. And at their 7-inch move, plus your advance, say on average 10-inch, you should reasonably be able to get them into another quarter without much trouble. On top of that, you might say, well, since they're pretty easy to kill, but that brings in another interesting point. If they're easy to kill, what's happening though is that you're forcing your opponent to try and shoot at them versus other units. And keep in mind, you're not putting them out in the open. They're hiding. They're trying to jump from, a piece of terrain to another to get to that. And then sometimes they can just sit in a ruin out of line of sight for the rest of the game, just farming those points. This is where I'm coming from with regards to them. In terms of a big blob of, you know, a 5-man where you spend 2 CP and they're -1 damage, blah, blah, blah. Is there value to that? I don't know. And potentially there could be value. That's something that I will want to try eventually. Sending one of those units up the middle, forcing the opponent to shoot it. If they do kill the whole unit, they have to get through 20 wounds. You've only invested 100 points in that, and then maybe you've preserved your other units. So bottom line, I think Chaos Spawn are an interesting choice. I don't think they're going to be the cornerstone of your army, but I think they are an interesting choice when you start to approach list building in terms of how you're going to score and how you're going to do that without interacting with the opponent too much. And they start to fill some of the gaps that Death Guard might suffer from. For example, lack of speed and lack of disposability. So, you know, Death Guard have a lot of elite units and you don't want to just throw them away. You need to get value out of your units to really participate meaningfully in the game. But if you start to bring units like, you know, Chaos Spawn, where maybe their value just is in being located somewhere, that could potentially be beneficial to your list. Keep in mind as well, so one thing you want to keep in mind, though, when you're doing that, and this we're going to get more into list design later, is that also has a trade-off. Though having 3 units of 1 is interesting in terms of approaching that, you know, that ability to farm engage points or whatever else you've designed them to do, there's some things that disadvantage you. For one, in list construction, say the typical battalion that we use for Death Guard, they're starting to take up those fast attack slots that you may want to otherwise use. If your list doesn't use them, then that's free. But if your list starts to use the fast attack slots, then they're starting to compete. And in a battalion, the fast attack, you're only allowed 3. Another downside to them is, yes, they are easy to kill. So what that may do is exclude you from secondaries such as Grind It Down. Now, Grind It Down is a very tricky one to take to begin with, because it relies on you killing more than your opponent. And now most people that approach Death Guard think, well, that should be fairly simple. We're tough units. So it just only makes sense that we should be able to kill more than they kill us. However, I mean, if you start approaching it, that you have Poxwalkers, you have other things that might get killed, you might end up in a situation where grind them down might not be as easy for you to accomplish. Not impossible, not for easy. And bringing units that are disposable like Chaos Spawn is kind of counterproductive to that approach. So there is, though I think they can bring some value, this is something you have to approach very carefully in list design. And you have to consider some of these downsides, like we said, how they kind of start to soak up your fast attack slots and how they might compromise your ability to take and score on stuff like Grind It Down. Next, let's talk about the Mephitic Blight Haulers. The Mephitic Blight Haulers is an interesting little model. It's a little chassis on a 80 mil base. I think that base size is unique to the Mephitic Blight Hauler. It's got a rocket launcher, it's got a multi-melta, it's got a little D3 flamer, and it does a couple little attacks in combat. It's tough 7, 9 wounds, and a 10-inch move. It's a 3-up save, and it's a demonic, so it's got a 5-up invul, and it's got -1 to hit in melee. So it is very interesting. Of course, I think the Mephitic Blight Haulers, if I'm not mistaken, approach the area of 135 to 145 points. Mephitic Blight Haulers are interesting because they have the smaller base size for a vehicle, and they are fast remove, like 10-inch, and they have the multi-melta, and now have a ballistic skill of 3, and they have the rocket launcher. So you could be potentially have 2.5, because I mean the rocket launcher, missile launcher, whatever it's called, is only AP2, but it still has 3 3 anti-tank weapons on that little chassis. Also, it has a strat that allows it to reduce the number of attacks per weapon targeting it by 1, and that costs 1 CP for 2 models and 2 CP for 3 models. So necessarily, you'll more than likely to take advantage of the return on investment there, take them in units of 2 versus units of 3. There is some interesting math that plays there. I had it on a sheet, but I think I went on a tear recently and just deleted all these, what I thought were extraneous files. Bottom line, with that strat, depending on the type of weapon, the Mythic Blight Hauler actually starts to approach the Plague Burst Crawler in terms of durability. So that's very interesting that you can actually get a very similar durability to a Plague Burst Crawler with your Mythic Blight Haulers. Of course, keep in mind that one of the challenges with the Mythic Blight Hauler, is not only that their weapons may be less effective because they have a shorter range, particularly for multi-metal. They don't have they don't have toughness 8, so strength 8 weapons are starting to wound them on 3s. They are a little faster on smaller base size, but they are also, I'm sorry, I should have prepared this, but I think they are also 135 or 145 points. We're going to figure this out right now. They're 140 points, so that was right in the middle. Plague Burst Crawlers with the entropy cannons are 175. So one of the challenges here is now for 35 points, you're getting a Plague Burst Crawler that has the toughness 8, 12 wounds, and whatnot. Of course, the Plague Burst Crawler also degrades. So, the Mythic Blight Hauler is a very interesting model, and we have seen them in armies that can do reasonably successful. One of the issues where I see this struggling is that I feel like the Plague Burst Crawler wins out for a couple of reasons. Plague Burst Crawler has the distance damage. So the Death Guard army relies on you being able to throw kind of covering fire as your troops get into contact with the enemy. If your dudes are just slogging across the battlefield, being shot all game before they get into combat, they're going to run into issues. So you're trying to encourage your opponent to shoot at things that are tough, that it can withstand that can interact back, and give your ground units time, like your Terminators or whatever, to get stuck in with the enemy and do their job. Now, the Mythic Blight Hauler can offer that, and they can also offer speed, which compensates for the issues that we were talking about before. The problem is they're not really doing either job very well. And the reason why, though they are 10-inch move, and why I don't think they're doing that job very well, is because they're base sizing because they don't fly. So now the problem with them is they're like any vehicle, they have to maneuver around the terrain. And it depends, if you're in a meta that there isn't a lot of terrain, then maybe that's okay. But if you're in a meta that has a lot of terrain, that can really impede their ability to travel across the board and be that element of speed you're looking for. Speed isn't just a reflection of, the definition of speed is, but in this context, it's not just a reflection of the moving characteristic of the model. It's ability to actually traverse distance. It's ability to displace on the board. So that being said, something that cannot breach ruins, and something with large enough base size to get stuck, despite having a 10-inch move, may not be able to take advantage of it as much as you would otherwise hope for. This is the reason why sometimes Death Watch players take bikes in their kill teams. They gain that infantry keyword, so now they get more value out of it because those bikes not only are fast, but they can breach, and they become obsec, and they can breach terrain. So they get a lot more value. They get a lot more speed out of those bikes. As a result, that's why you start to see more bikes from Death Watch players than, say, for example, other Marine players. So this is where the poor little Mythic Blight Hauler can struggle. You can make a case where you have a unit of 2 or unit of 3, and then across the amount of space they take up on a board with their 2-inch coherency and their 2 to 3 inch bases can end up being like 11, 12 inches. And so then if you pass a contagion onto them, say, for example, Ferret Blight, or if you take the Ferryman and you take the Droning, they can cover actually a significant distance with your contagion. That is a very interesting strategy. Of course, running into the issue of at 140 points a model, you spend 420 points to do this. And it's kind of like a one trick every couple of games you would do it. And what are you trying to get out of it? So this bottom line is, I think, where we're struggling to come with a value from Mythic Blight Haulers. They seem to me almost like that thing where you take 3 units of 2 and that's where you'll get their value. That will be at almost, I think, 3 units of 2. What would I say? They're 140 points, 560. Yeah, 800 points. Is that 800 points for 6 of those Mythic Blight Haulers? So I think that's the challenge. I think you might see, of course, I'm saying that, but if we're in a meta We might see a resurgence, now that I think of it, of mephitic blight haulers and using them more in, say, for example, AdMech. And the reason I say that because AdMech rely on a couple of things. One thing they rely on is their chicken walkers with their las cannon. Because you have that strat to be able to reduce the amount of shots targeting that unit. That's interesting because now those las cannons will only be getting one shot versus two. Same thing with sister retributors. They'd only be getting one shot instead of two. And similarly, the AdMech strat that allows them to auto wound against non-vehicle models on a 4-up would not work on them because they're vehicles. So, I mean, clever list design in the current meta might justify their use. This is why I'm mentioning them. I feel like they are a unit worth mentioning. They aren't an auto take, but maybe a clever player and somebody that really has a plan, knows the meta, and knows what they're going to use them for, can implement them effectively in their army. And potentially something maybe I will myself revisit in the future. Next, I want to talk about the floated blow drone. So this is similar. This is 135 points, or depending on the weapon type. I mean, you can give them. Let's talk about the chassis first. My apologies. It's a 10-inch move flying vehicle, and it's basically got all but the same stat line as the mephitic blight hauler weapon, skill blitz, skill 3. Now, this is the infamous one that's got the flesh mower, or the plague spitters, or the heavy blight launcher. It's demonic and whatever else. It doesn't have any other special ability like the mephitic blight haulers, the -1 attack in combat. However, the drones do have a couple of strats that are particularly applicable to them. One, the strat, I think it's called Dark Cravings, that allows a drone to heroic since 6 inches. I've used that to much effect. And it's also got the strat that every time it kills a model, it can regenerate, in close combat, it can regenerate a wound, up to 3 wounds. And that can be very useful as well if you want to keep these things alive. Now, I've been using them to quite decent effect. And the reason why is, one, they are fast and they do fly. So these are the types of models that I use to be able to push up the board and score those engage on all fronts points that I find if you design your list, then those are easy points to get. Now, you won't, based on their speed, you won't get them likely turn 1 depending on your map, particularly like Hammer and Anvil and Dawn of War deployments. But you can almost rely on them for turn 2 to get them. And I mean, depending on how you set it up, you can approach a 3-point engage on all fronts on turn 2 or 3, 4, 5, depending on your doing, meaning you can score somewhere in the area of 10 to 12 points on engage, which is reasonable. Like we had said in our first episode, as you approach 9 points per secondary, you're approaching a 70% win probability in your game, assuming your primary goes well. So the different weapons you have are the plague spitters, the heavy blight launcher, and the flesh mower. Now, the flesh mower, will get that one out of the way. It is the melee weapon. It gives them its strength. It'll be at their strength 6, AP2, 2 damage. And the neat thing here is it gives 3 attacks per attack. So the mower drone has 12 attacks in close combat. Now, this could be absolutely ruthless, and it's a plague weapon, so it can be absolutely ruthless against marine bodies, particularly, and then you can get clever if the opponent wants to infiltrate some of their marines, like incursors and infiltrators, then you may be able to get that first turn charge, mow them, and then cross the line and get your engage, get that objective. So that's very interesting, and it's just a general melee threat to almost every army. You have the plague spitters. It's a 2d6 12-inch flamer, which is decent, -1. The flamer is always good. The problem I have with the flamer, despite being particularly good against MSU, is it can spike, but the randomness in the number of the shots and the range. Like we mentioned before, you have to balance the effectiveness of this model across, its effectiveness is either going to be in how much it does every turn, like an average of how much it does every turn. So flesh mower, you might only be able to use it for 2 or 3 turns in combat, but the amount of attacks it brings will just absolutely devastate, or has the potential to have absolutely devastate a unit. The plague spitter, however, at 12 inches requires you still to close in with the enemy, and then the actual shots that it gives off can be somewhat underwhelming. In my opinion, if you're going for something like that, you might as well just forget the photo blow drone and go with the greater blight drone. Why? The greater blight drone has a D6 flavor. It's not 2d6, it's 1d6. It has a auto 4-shot auto cannon, 1 damage auto cannon, but it's also a 14-inch move. So now this is the type of drone you can take to actually start scoring. Assuming you go first and it doesn't get shot, or I mean, you can go second as long as it doesn't get killed. That has the speed to be able to score your engage in all fronts turn 1. So, I mean, I'm in the opinion that if you're going for a drone, it's either going to be the blight launcher or the mower. And if you want the flamer drone, you probably should just invest in a greater blight drone. Next is the heavy blight launcher. You don't see this too often, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm the first one to have identified its use. I actually saw this out of Don Huson's list. Heavy blight launcher is an assault 6, strength 6, AP3 damage 2 plague weapon. It's 36-inch range. Why do I like this? Well, like we had said before, we're talking about how much use we can get out of units over the course of the game, and a 36-inch weapon like that means you can almost always get shots every single turn. So this is always participating, and being 10-inch move and fly means you can start to get angles on units the opponent doesn't want you to interact with. So you can start chasing those units your opponent doesn't want you to find. That's what I like about this. It also, being fast, can still participate with engage and whatever other objectives, and its gun is a decent enough profile that you can do chip damage to stronger targets, so your T7, T8 targets, or you could do meaningful damage to medium platforms like your types of raiders, your chicken walkers. They're tough 6. If you happen to have something within range of them to offer the contagion, they can be tough 5, getting more benefit out of them. Or they can actually be pretty dangerous against marine type chassis. And I mean, Marines aren't the top of the meta right now, but you are still going to see Marines. And you still need to bring some element of these type of weapons, because if you show up with no ability to interact with Marines, you're going to run into issues the second you do interact with Marines. They also offer AP3, which is interesting because it starts to circumvent these armies like, Lucius or whatnot that have the ignore AP1, 2 rules for their like Scutari units. So for example, if you shoot that at 2 damage, not only are the Lucius Marines not going to benefit, or Lucius units not going to benefit from their +1 armor saves for being damage 1, but now you're going to punch through that resistance to AP1 too. I mean, it's only 6 shots, but starting to peel off models from the Scutari units will start to pull away from their effectiveness and ability to, to score and do damage. I've been really enjoying the drones. I really like them. I still think they are they could benefit from being about 5 to 10 to 15 points lower, but what player doesn't think that any of their units are properly costed? Everybody thinks they could use 5, 10, 15 more points. I still like these models, and I've been using 3 in my latest list, and I have had reasonable success against armies like Drukhari and whatnot using them. So this is why I mentioned the Folded Blow Drone. The Plague Burst Crawler. Now we're in the heavy support, and to be honest, the heavy support, I think this will be the only model we're going to talk about for the heavy support. The reason why, well, we can talk about Predators. I don't think we're going to see those. They don't offer a cost to toughness to damage delivery that we need, particularly in the meta that we're seeing now. The Land Raider is laughable, unfortunately. And the Defiler, same. I think Defiler is really struggling to find its place. It does okay in combat, it's got a okay shooting, but at its cost, it's not really exactly delivering on what we need. And on top of that, it doesn't have Disgusting Resilient. If we were talking about a model that had Disgusting Resilient, we'd be having a different conversation. Yes, it does Infernal Regeneration, so it regenerates a wound, but the lack of Disgusting Resilience mean those weapons that the enemy throws into you that are damage 2 or damage 3 are getting twice or 50% more efficiency versus you than your other Disgusting Resilient vehicles. So that's why we're referring to the Plague Burst Crawler. The Plague Burst Crawler I think is delightful. Unfortunately, it has hit a bit of a points cost upgrade since 8th edition, so I do feel like we're paying a premium for it, but it is a toughness 8 12 wound vehicle that's 3 up save. It now has a 3 ballistic skill of 3, which is great. We don't have to rely on prescience, and we don't get prescience anymore. That's been closed, so we're good there. It does degrade, but it still means that on your medium profile you have a 4 up ballistic skill. Regardless, we do have a 1 CP strat to allow it to act at its top profile, so you can still use it. It also has a strat for 1 CP to increase the damage of its mortar by 1 and deliver mortal wounds around your target at 3 inches for 4 up. 1 mortal wound per unit. So let me clarify. For each unit within 3, you roll a die. On a 4 up, they take a mortal wound. So what does it have? Well, you get the option between the entropy cannon and the plague spitters. You get the mortar, and you get the option between the volley gun and the heavy slugger. It has, like we said, disgusting resilient and a 5 up in vol. The other interesting part about this, despite also getting a bit of a points upgrade in the terms of CP going from 1 to 2, is that you can use the stratagem Putrid Detonation on a Plague Burst Crawler to auto-explode it once it dies, meaning that every unit within 6 inches, including Nurgle units, this one doesn't exclude Nurgle units, takes D3 mortal wounds. And that can be pretty clutch in situations where you've pushed it up, it's been destroyed, your enemy has a lot of their units around it. You can reasonably splash mortal wounds across it. It's a fairly decent maneuver that I've used to fairly good effect. Now, why do we like this? Well, it's tough. It can sit on your back. Death Guard struggles with MSU. We don't have a lot of opportunity to bring a lot of units. Our units can be expensive. Not only that, we are restricted in terms of the amount of Poxwalkers we can bring based on our list construction. So we do still struggle in our ability to maintain our backfield objectives because we can't just willy-nilly take units of Poxwalkers. Our list relies on having Bubonic Astartes to take them. So there's a lot of mental gymnastics that goes into making our list, so it can be a struggle to have those throwaway units sit on our backfield objectives. And like we said, Death Guard, despite being a new book, is starting to struggle in the meta in a sense that it's harder to compete with the new books coming out with all the tools they have. So we have to be more efficient with our choices. So the Plague Burst Crawler do several things, being a tough backfield unit that protects our backfield objective. And given that it has the 48-inch mortar that can shoot out a line of sight, it can still interact with the enemy meaningfully, despite not really participating in the battle if you keep it from being shot by in itself, keeping it out on a line of sight. You can give it plague spitters or entropy cannons. Entropy cannons are it's 1 shot each. There's 2 cannons. Strength 8, AP4, D3 plus 3 damage. It's Death Guard's version of the las cannon or multi-melta, whatever you want. This is interesting because it's kind of one of our only abilities outside if you take, predators whose las cannons still are only D6, or you can take Defiler that has the 3 damage Defiler cannon, but it's still one of our only meaningful ways of interacting with anti-tank weaponry to the enemy at 36-inch range. It's a plague weapon, so you get to reroll once to wound. That can be very useful in metas like, what's it called? Abmech with flyers or chicken walkers. Drukhari with their raiders, or anything else that are bringing vehicles or tough units. It's got its mortar, like we had mentioned. We can upgrade it. And then it's also got the slugger, the Rothhail volley gun. Probably not worth spending extra shots on the Rothhail, though it is rapid fire. So at 24 inches, it will be 6 shots. It's take it or leave it. Your heavy slugger is still 5 inches and at 4 shots, strength 5, and at 36 inches is still 4 shots. So that's still pretty decent. So bottom line, I think the big thing with the Plague Burst Crawler, I think they belong in lists. You're probably going to want to take 2 or 3. I think 2 is the sweet spot personally, but I can't fault people for taking 3. They are good. Is deciding whether you want Plague Spitters or entropy cannons, and I think it's going to depend on your style of play. Plague Spitters can do very well against the MSU style meta we find ourselves in, where you might be surrounded by a lot of different units. You might be tagged, so it can shoot into combat and be able to start peeling away the things that are attaching itself to it. Of course, Plague Spitters will necessitate a more aggressive playstyle. You'll have to get in there with your Plague Burst Crawlers. And then Plague Spitters, like anything else, can fall flat. You can roll 4 shots, 3 wounds, and whatever else, and that's not a lot of value. Of course, you can end up with a similar situation with your entropy cannons and just miss with both shots. I take the entropy cannons, and the reason why is because we don't have a lot of shooting elements in an army to be able to interact with backfield stuff like, well, I mean, they're not backfield, but say, for example, raiders. If you go first, you want to be able to start peeling off as many raiders as possible, as quickly as possible. Entropy cannon needs to give you that opportunity. Plague Spitters will not. Plague Spitters help you interact with the units once they're out. So, I mean, that's a debate, right? In the AdMech matchup, Entropy Cannons allow you to interact with Chicken Walkers. Plague Spitters, especially taking Lucius, you're not going to get a lot of value out of them. So I think that your choice can depend on your playstyle and depend on your current meta in your area, or depending on the tournament you go to. But bottom line, I think based on mechanized non-deterministic lists, you're going to want to consider some Plague Burst Crawlers. So there we are. That was a fast attack and Mephitic Blight Haulers. Fast attack and the heavy support is 837. It's a shorter one today. I think left for the book we have to talk about is Mortarion and some of the Forge World units. I mean, we can talk about those now. Forge World units. There are some Forge World units for Death Guard worth mentioning. I'll mention 2. I mean, you can probably say there's the Levy Dread, there's Daredeo Dreads. Problem is, I don't think they're offering an awful lot. The Levy Dread potentially, but I think the Levy Dread is Fire Than Dread is a lot of points into something that isn't any more durable, really. And we don't have a lot of ways to make it more durable. What I like about, for example, I take a Contemptor Dreadnought, is that has a standard kind of Contemptor platform. It's -1 damage from its Eternal Hate, whatever their rule is for Dreadnoughts, Eternal Hatred or Eternal Warrior, whatever it is that gives them -1 damage outside of our Disgusting Resilient. It's got a 5-up invul. It's tough 7, 9 wounds. Bliss skill 3. But the interesting thing about the Contemptor Dreadnought is its core. And the weapons you give them are particularly interesting, like the Volkite. They're not Culverins, the Volkite cans, whatever they're called. They're 8 shots each, so 16 for the Dreadnought. Strength 6, 0 AP, 2 damage, and for every 6 to wound, you do a mortal wound. Why do I like them? Oh, they're also 45-inch range. Why do I like them? I like them because they offer an extremely long-range ability to interact with the opponent. And with mortal wounds, they're almost a threat to everything. It's like kind of your jack-of-all-trades gun. Is it great against everything? No. You won't come up against a knight and do a ton of damage to it. But potentially, in your finest hour, you may need to do chip damage to a knight, and this is something that can do it. You can be in another situation where you're looking at 20 gaunts and you need to start peeling those gaunts away. Well, I mean, you could set it up that this is within the Tallyman. Because it's core, you can give it +1 to hit, so it's hitting on 2s, and if your Tallyman has a Toll Keeper, it explodes on 6s. So what you could be looking at is 19 shots, or 16 shots turning into, 16 to 18 hits, and then wounding on 2s on those gaunts. So you could be looking at like 15 or 16 gaunts that are wounded. They'll take, I think they have a 6-up save, so you can still kill about 14 gaunts if you include the mortal wounds. So that's a reasonable way to interact with hordes of models across the table. Or it's a particularly good weapon against raiders. Raiders are tough 6, but they only have a 4-up save. 4 3-up save, but these are 2 damage, so they're a good way of peeling wounds off stuff like raiders and planes and whatever else. So I like that. We'd already mentioned the Greater Blight Drone. The interesting thing about the Greater Blight Drone is the fast thing we got. It's a 14-inch move, and it's got the smaller guns. That's one model you might be consider your list choices for secondaries that don't require interaction with the enemy. Okay, so that's that. Last, we'll talk about Mortarion. I didn't put it in the description, but we have some time to talk about Mortarion because we didn't have a lot of units to go over today. So, what do we think about Mortarion? Well, Mortarion, when he first came out, there was a lot of criticism that he was broken because it was very difficult to kill. Of course, this was in a This was at a time where there was only several books that had come out, and at that time, yes, he was more challenging to kill because a lot of the weapons hadn't come out yet, like those from Admech and Sisters and Drukhari. Of course, we've arrived in a situation now where armies are getting more and more ability to either kill Mortarion or hang him up, or just not really care about Mortarion. And why is that? Well, for example, the Skitarii unit from Admech, depending on how you build it with the right buffs, you can actually get a 20-man Skitarii unit and have a 35% chance of just straight up one-shotting Mortarion. And that's a 160-point unit. So that can be a very dangerous situation to be in, particularly since Mortarion is almost 500 points. He's 400 and I don't know what he is, 470, 480 points. Do people do well with Mortarion? Yes, they can do very well with Mortarion because there are armies that will straight up struggle to interact with him. He was more efficient before when we could warp time him. We can no longer warp time him. There is no possible way to warp time him. But he is still a tough model that moves 12, that once he touches the enemy can be very, very difficult to deal with. The problem I have with Mortarion is not only is he a quarter of your army's points, but Mortarion isn't giving you a leg up in the matches that you're going to struggle against. Mortarion will help you destroy and annihilate the armies that you already are beating. He'll help you beat them better, but he won't help you in matches that you struggle against. What are those matches? Drukhari. Mortarion can't be everywhere at once. Drukhari can. Drukhari can spend their time just avoiding Mortarion and taking the other half aboard. Same thing with, Tyranids can probably do that. Harlequins can do that. Admech don't really care because Admech can throw bodies at Mortarion, or they can just straight up kill Mortarion because of the style shooting, and he'll struggle to be hidden. Marines will struggle with Mortarion, but you're already, pretty decent into Marines. So it's not something that you're generally worried about anyways. So really bringing Mortarion to that fight doesn't really offer you an advantage other than that you're just going to win more. Whereas we have to design our list. I think the better approach for list design is giving you the ability to interact with everybody. Yes, it might make the games that we would normally just steamroll over a little harder, but it also means that when you approach the table like Drukhari or Admech, that you're not just going to lose straight up because of your list. So this is one of the problems I have with Mortarion. Despite him still being very tough and can be very killy, I just think he's one model and he's not doing enough to help us in the matches we're going to struggle against. Okay, so we've talked about our fast attack choices, our heavy support choices, a couple of key, forgeable units, and also Mortarion. Next week, I think we can start to finally look into list building and how we're going to approach our list and what we're looking at when we build our lists. And we can talk about how we're going to approach the current meta. If you have any questions, shout them out. If you can put them in the comments below. I like to respond to the questions that these videos get. They've been helpful. For example, for one, I wanted to mention this at the beginning, but like I said, I mailed this one in a bit, so I forgot. In a previous video, I'd mentioned that Photodvirion, their special list building flexibility is that you can take 3 for one slot. That's not true. You can take up to 3. So keep in mind that when you're using Photodvirion, you can have up to 3, so that can be 2 as well, but they have to be distinct models. So either, your Foul Blightspawn and a Biologist Putrefier, or, a Blightbringer and a Plague Surgeon and a, Putrefier, whatever. They can all be lumped as one elite choice versus each individually taking 3 elite choices. The last video, I mistakenly said that you have to take 3 for 1 and that 2 for 1 doesn't count. It actually does. So thanks to one of the viewers for pointing that out. So like I said, if you don't have any questions, that's okay. If you like this content, just like the video, share it, comment below. Let me know you do. If there's any changes, do you want me to bring back the visual aids to the streams, or do you prefer just kind of sitting and chatting here? If that's it, I wish everybody a good weekend, and we'll see everybody next week when we go over list building.